to talk about the ups and downs of elevators. Ha ha ha. Sorry, had to get that one out of the way. And also sorry if I may have stolen any of the comic thunder from the panelists. But luckily there's a whole lot of bad elevator puns out there to choose from, so go for it. Um, okay, I'm Dan Bertolet, Director of the Housing and Cities Program at Sightline Institute. And we're so happy to be hosting this conversation with Welcoming Neighbors Network and a great panel of elevator nerds. And of course, by nerds, I mean experts. Um, but before I introduce them, I want to share some good news from Sightline's turf out here in the Pacific Northwest. Just last month, Washington state lawmakers passed, with strong bipartisan support, Senate Bill 5156 is the first statewide elevator reform legislation passed in um, the bill legalizes smaller elevators in small-scale residential buildings and also mandates a reassessment of other costly elevator requirements. And it's really a great start on the broader code reforms we need all across the United States and Canada to reduce the cost of elevators, get more of them built into our new housing, and create an abundance of accessible, age-friendly homes. Okay, so some quick housekeeping. Please submit any questions you may have through the Q&A function, and we'll organize them for the panelists to address in the last 15 minutes of the hour. This discussion will be recorded, and we'll share it out next week, so keep an eye on your inbox if you want to share that recording with others. And with that, I'll introduce you to our moderator and panelists, who will then get deep into it on elevators. First, Stephen Smith, our moderator. He's the founder of the Center for Building in North America and author of the landmark report that put this issue on the map. He's also the reason Washington had an elevator bill at all. Pretty much all we had to do was download Stephen's brain into bill language. So it was a great experience working with Stephen on that bill. Okay, next, Cassie Wilson. She's the legislative manager of Thousand Friends of Oregon, and she strategizes on passing more pro-housing and related laws in our region. And she is a disabled renter in Portland. Shane Boland is director of development with Owen Gabbert LLC, a real estate development and commercial construction firm in the Northwest. And Ute Lee is founder and director of About Here, and he crafted the awesome video about our elevator shortage that many of you have likely seen. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Stephen, our moderator.
Thank you very much, Dan. So welcome to our discussion about elevators. I'm coming to you all from my five-story single stair walk-up building, no elevator in New York City. It was built in 2015 and is sort of an illustration of what can go wrong when elevators cost too much and are too difficult to put into buildings. So I like my building, but I do wish it had an elevator. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, tell a little bit. I mean, Dan gave us a little bit of introduction, but tell us a little bit about your personal and professional relationship to elevators, or a lack thereof. And I'm just going to call on you in the order I see you. So I'm going to go with first Shane, then Cassie, then Ute.
Yeah,
Shane,
thank you,
off to you.
Stephen. My name's Shane Boland. I use he, him pronouns. I have a background in kind of policy and architecture, but currently I'm the director of development at company Owen Gabbert LLC. We work in development and construction, and a large bulk of our development work is focused on affordable infill housing. So I spend a lot of time kind of grappling with how to develop and build on smaller infill lots in central locations, and those kind of smaller efficient buildings often come in pretty direct conflict with the ability and cost of elevators, and the kind of correlating accessibility that comes with that. So I just spent a lot of time, thinking on a policy wonk and kind of fundamental construction and development feasibility about elevators and small lots and the development that goes with them. So really happy to be here and be sharing the screen with these panelists. Thanks all.
Hi everyone, Cassie Wilson. As mentioned, I'm the legislative manager at 1000 Friends of Oregon. For those who may not know, we are a nonprofit watchdog for Oregon's unique land use planning program. We work to protect and enhance quality of life for all Oregonians by protecting farm and forest lands and creating great communities in our cities and towns through smart growth planning. I actually originally joined as our transportation policy manager, but I really generally love doing anything related to climate, housing, transportation, land use, and accessibility. I'm a disabled renter in Portland, and so really much of my introduction to this conversation about elevator reform and accessible housing has very much come through my lived experience. I'm still learning a lot about the technical policy side of things. I use a mobility scooter, so I absolutely depend on elevators. Um, my favorite elevator fun fact about myself is that I've never gotten stuck in one, despite using them more than non-disabled people. But I've had lots of experiences where one is broken or there just isn't an elevator at all, which obviously causes issues. Thanks.
Okay, and I'm last. Hello, everyone. I'm Yute. And like Dan mentioned in his introduction, I have a YouTube channel and a video production studio called About Here. My professional relationship to elevators and perhaps my only qualifications for this panel is that I produced a video about elevators in North America, and kind of similar to this Washington bill, I also basically copied and pasted Stephen's wonderful report into a script and then turned that into a video, which, to my surprise, has been just been a lot more popular than I could have ever imagined as a piece of content on YouTube. So that's sort of my the work I've done on elevators, at least so far. And then, I thought about like a personal anecdote I have about elevators. I moved out of an apartment last August of 2025. And in that apartment, the elevator had been broken for several months. And I just checked back as to the status of that elevator. It is still broken, like almost a year later. And I mean, the building's management was awful, and that's part of the reason why I left. But like, I think, perhaps a little bit of a nugget of an anecdote to kick things off today.
All right, thank you all. Cassie, I've only been stuck in an elevator once, but it was not very fun, so I hope it does not come for you. So Cassie, I'm also going to direct the first question to you. So, you said you work at 1000 Friends of Oregon, so you guys are tracking, a lot of land use changes across Oregon, which I think are kind of emblematic of what we see across the Pacific Northwest, West Coast, and, more broadly the country. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the land use and other reforms that you're seeing lately in Oregon, and especially around missing middle housing, small multifamily buildings in general, single family, sort of upzoning of single family neighborhoods?
Absolutely, yes. So, over the last 5 or 6 years, the state and some cities have passed a lot of upzoning policies. So, first started with, legalizing accessory dwelling units in cities with 2,500 or more population. And then really took off from there. We ended exclusionary single family housing zoning, requiring that cities with 2,500 plus population allow for duplexes on single family home lots, and bigger cities allowing for triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters on single family lots. And then, continuing to build on that, the state passed the climate friendly and equitable communities rules in 2020 that required that all cities with 50,000 people or more essentially have to identify climate friendly areas in their city to, the way I would describe it is basically to design a 15-minute neighborhood, is essentially what it comes down to. And so making it easier to get where you need to go without having to go far. And yeah, increasing density, access to transit, walkability. And then more recently at the state level, they passed the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, also known as ONA, which is a comprehensive framework for every city in the state to address housing needs with state coordination and support. So a lot of folks who are really in the weeds on that, really appreciate my colleagues who are working on that. And then for Portland specifically, last year, the building code was updated to allow for one stairwell in apartment buildings up to 4 stories. So that was a really exciting development, and we're really hoping to see more of that statewide.
Thank you. I was a little bit involved in the single stair thing, and I believe Oregon is the first one to adopt it. My hope is that it'll be sort of throughout the state, elsewhere. I think there's been some growing pains in Oregon around the fire marshal and some fire apparatus access, but still ongoing, and hopefully they get to a point where the 4-story single stair buildings are allowed. So Cassie, well, this is a question for you, Shane. So Cassie described sort of this growth in the upzoning. So we first had the ADUs, then we get to the duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and then we get to these sort of somewhat more mid-rise buildings. We get up to the mid-rise buildings, and then we get to these 4-story single stair buildings. And just to give some background, what makes a single stair building safe is that it doesn't have very many units on each floor. So I think the limit is sort of emerging as around 4 units per floor, which, is nice in a lot of ways. It allows sort of a lot of light. I'm in my single stair building. I've got windows on 2 sides. Every unit is generally a corner unit, a little more friendly, neighborly. You can kind of get to know your neighbors. Sometimes they can be cheaper, especially to sort of maintain, since you don't have a lot of amenities in such a small building. But it does present a bit of a problem for elevators because, an elevator is a fixed cost. In the United States, they can be, just the elevator itself sort of pushing $200,000 for a 4-story building compared to maybe a quarter of that in sort of cost of living adjusted terms in Europe. And whether you've got 4 units on the floor or 20 units on the floor, the elevator sort of costs the same amount of money. So Shane, tell us a little bit about the economics of sticking an elevator in such a small building. Do you think these are going to get buildings, or excuse me, do you think these buildings are going to get elevators? Do you think they'll just sort of, meet the minimum accessibility standards with just some accessible units on the ground floor and there'll be walk-ups? Tell me, I don't think we've seen a lot of these buildings yet in Oregon, but, based on your sense of how the economics work, tell us, are we going to get elevators in the 4-story buildings?
No, I don't think we are. So I think for 16 units, it's going to be really rare to see an elevator. The few examples I can think of are going to be at a really kind of extremely high price point for new construction, likely kind of high-end condos, maybe some very specific kind of age-in-place co-housing sort of developments that, need an elevator as part of their kind of built environment. But I think for kind of your standard expected market-driven infill housing, the cost to put an elevator for anywhere under kind of 30, 40 units is usually pretty prohibitive unless there's something else driving that, whether it's the folks who are living there or it's at a price point that kind of demands an elevator. So that would drive, your accessibility is going to be primarily, the one type A unit that would be required for your under 20 units with some adaptable type B units on the ground floor. And I think, there is a lot of value that still comes from the single stair 4-story buildings. It allows density in areas that may not have gotten it, but I don't think it will be a housing typology that brings a lot of accessibility to bear, given elevator costs where they are right now.
Well, easy answer, not the easiest to hear, but thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, something that motivated my research was I noticed that in Europe, I spend my procrastination is looking at floor plans for buildings in Europe, and a lot of them are quite small, not more than 10, 20 units, sharing a single stair. And I just noticed they tend to all have elevators. And in New York, my experience in New York, where we've allowed single stair buildings up to 6 stories, is certainly the 4-story, and even sort of some of the 4 going into 5-story buildings tend not to have the elevators. I've noticed in Seattle, the condo buildings that were built in the, 70s, 80s, 90s tend to have them elevators. And then I guess as elevators have been getting more difficult to build on the West Coast due to condo defect liability and other sort of issues, we get more rentals. And I have noticed more walk-ups too. And I share your fear that in the four-story buildings, there are going to be a lot of walk-ups that are not accessible to disabled people, not accessible to, elderly people, not accessible to people who just want an elevator and don't want to schlep up 3 flights of stairs to the fourth floor every day. So, okay, so it sounds like we have some issues with elevator costs. So Yute, you published a video a few months ago on the topic, and I encourage everyone to watch it. A lot of it was based on my research, which got pretty technical. So tell me, the report was 122 pages, and I'm sure everyone here read every single word of it. But for those who didn't, your video is a really great introduction. So how did you take such a sort of technical topic and make it relatable? And maybe if you could tell me one or two things that stood out to you making the video.
Well, first off, I would highly recommend people read Steven's report as well. It is, I would say, it was actually really well written, and I read a lot of reports for my work, and definitely there's some page-turning moments, some really great stories in there, some details we really thought about getting into that ultimately for length we kind of ended up cutting out. But yeah, I mean, the process of making a complex issue into a story is, I struggle to come up with any great sort of formulas or patterns to it because it feels like with each story there's sort of a I'm reinventing the wheel perhaps and kind of it's sort of a case by case basis. But for this video specifically, I mean, I think one thing I'll say I really grappled with was what I should start the video with. And that's with every video. It's like, what is that hook? What gets people invested in this topic up front? And I think when it comes to this issue, there's kind of two reasons why people should really care about it. And there's one that's really, I would say in my mind, much more emotional. It's about all of these folks who absolutely rely on elevators, actually have no other options than to take an elevator, who are completely excluded from so many spaces in our city because of the shortage of elevator, can't find housing in so many neighborhoods in the city because there's a shortage of elevators or no elevators. And I, thought about like, is that the intro? But I think the other sort of intro that I kind of ended up landing on was just how this shortage of elevators really impacts everybody at the end of the day. I mean, it's not like elevators are only for people who need them. It's anybody who's carrying groceries, anyone who lives in any building above, I would argue, like 2 stories. You start really wanting some sort of, easy ride at the end of the day. If you're having if you have a stroller, there's so many. I mean, if you're older, right, a senior citizen, right, I think quickly became apparent to me that there could be a really broad entry point for people to care about this issue. And so that's how I ended up structuring the video, starting with these kind of anecdotes that to me would strike any reasonable person as just kind of unreasonable, insane, right? Like 6-story walk-up buildings that are just built in the last decade that don't have an elevator. I mean, I guess like your building, Stephen. Elevators that have been broken for months and months and months. In Vancouver, I found a couple examples of condos where it's like, something like 80 to 100, I mean, maybe 100 might be an exaggeration, but it was like definitely like around 80 units or so, and they just had one elevator. And so, to me, I found that those sort of examples could be a pretty compelling way to start the story. And my strategy sort of later on in the story was to sprinkle in some of the more emotional beats around actually once you realize, how the severity of the impacts on people who actually rely on these elevators, the problem doesn't become nearly, it becomes a lot more serious, in my opinion. Maybe I should leave it at that because there's so much I could get into when it comes to script writing. But, of course, there's a lot of conversations around like what kind of stays in the script, stays out of the script, and happy to talk about that more if there's interest later.
Thank you. Speaking of the elevator ratios, I think Toronto has probably the worst elevator ratios on earth. Someone sent me some data about new buildings, high rises, and a lot of them have fewer than one elevator per 100 units. which really
Yep.
suggests that, developers are desperate not to include, or, to include as few elevators as they can in the buildings, which can lead to some pretty long lines for elevators when one is taken out of service.
Totally.
So when I published my report, you mentioned that you sort of started with sort of the personal, the human side of it. And, the report was very technical, and I probably shouldn't have been surprised, but I was a little surprised at how passionately everyone, they all had a personal experience. So, Cassie, I had a question for you. You mentioned you use a mobility scooter, you depend on an elevator to get to anywhere that's not the ground floor. And so I just wanted to, could you tell us a little bit about your experience as a tenant, as a renter, looking for housing in Portland or wherever else you may have lived? Was it easy? Was it hard? Tell us how it's been looking for housing.
Yeah, so, and this will kind of zoom out a little bit from elevators specifically, but really speaks to the overall lack of accessible housing. Only 0.3% of all housing in Oregon is accessible. When I say accessible, I mean type A accessible, which may be nerdier than anyone wants to get into today. But really encourage folks to learn more about accessible housing outside of this as well. But basically, that means in terms of units that, it's not just about getting inside, it's also about being able to reach things like appliances. My first apartment was I mean, when I was first looking at my first apartment, I had no idea what to look for as a disabled renter, and property managers really also didn't know what to say or how to help. A lot of them did not know which of their units were fully accessible. They didn't keep track, they didn't advertise them as accessible. And so I thought that I didn't have options. And that's partly because there is so little fully accessible housing that it's hard to just stumble across. Um, and because type A accessible housing is only required in large multifamily buildings with 20 or more units, and even then, only 2% of units need to be accessible, hence how there is so little across the state. And so it's been extremely hard to find accessible units because they're not listed. And I mean, I also just don't feel like I really have much housing choice, which is something we talk a lot about when it comes to, legalizing middle housing, is giving people more choice in what type of home they live in. And I really only have the choice to live in large multifamily buildings. And as we legalize things like elevator reform and single stair, we will need to address the threshold at which type A units are required. Because as long as it stays at 20 plus, elevators will help me get inside, but they won't make my unit more accessible. But it's also, essential for uh, being able to do more infill development to increase the number of just overall accessible units. I mean, my friends live in smaller buildings and I just simply can't go over to visit them because there's only stairs. So definitely essential for accessibility, essential for density, climate, preventing sprawl. Yeah.
Thank you. Um, Ute, things, I mentioned elevators are more expensive in North America, but the truth is we also have higher incomes. A lot of things are more expensive than North America. Food is more expensive. We're not starving. So tell me, like, how bad are these costs really? Like, what are some of the drivers of it? And what effect does it have? What effect do these costs have on the housing stock?
I'd be happy to attempt to answer that question, but I'll sheepishly admit I feel like this is like trying to explain the Force to Yoda here. Like you are the expert, man. I've literally got your report right here in front of me, so I can quote it back to you. How bad are our costs really? I mean, well, if you look over at countries, and I would say like countries with probably similar incomes to the ones we have in North America, like Switzerland. They're paying $35,000, and I believe you converted it to USD for their elevators. And it goes up to like maybe like 50 or $60,000 on the high end for cities like Belgium. Oh no, not Belgium's not a city. Flanders in Belgium, or or cities in France. But in North America, at least, in this report, those costs can be upwards of 150, $170,000. And I know in Canada, it's not unheard of to see elevators cost between, well, not between, but like $200,000 for a single elevator. Correct me if I'm wrong, but so to me that it totally stands out as a really, you know, wild difference in costs. Now, what are the drivers of that cost? It's a bit complicated, but the first one would be, and I'd say the most simple to understand is just the sheer size requirements around elevators in North America. Our elevators are significantly larger and required to be so for a number of, I guess, somewhat understandable reasons, but somewhat also arbitrary. A lot of it has to do with how whether a wheelchair can do a three-point turn inside the elevator. In Europe, the requirement is the understanding is wheelchair users can go in and out, sort of back in and out. Stretcher requirements and interpretations of how a stretcher fits in an elevator, and based on that coming up with some sort of dimension. It's really quite messy, and I'm sure Stephen, you could add a lot more color to that explanation as well. But then I'd say the big one that stood out to me was just that our, I guess, sort of regulation body or universe of elevator codes in North America is just on an island of itself, outside of the rest of the world. And so it turns out, like, I don't know exactly what era it was, maybe in like the 80s or 90s. I can double check, but like, sort of the rest of the world, like every country except for Canada, US, and Japan, decided to align themselves around one universal standard for elevators. And what that really did was it opened up a competitive market for elevator manufacturers and suppliers so that you could manufacture an elevator part in, I don't know, India or in Brazil, and you could somewhat reliably install that in an elevator in Belgium. In North America, to build an elevator or make an elevator part for the American market, it has to conform to our unique elevator code, which, by the way, isn't even consistent across North America. I think there's something like, oh gosh, what's the number? There's many
There's
jurisdictions.
about 100 different
100,
jurisdictions sort of
yes.
set their own rules.
Right. So think you've got like 100 different jurisdictions, each with their sort of little differences around elevator codes and what sort of elevator parts need to, I don't know, even like the thickness of certain doors or the dimensions of certain parts. It all sort of creates this really complex uh uh, I guess, landscape of regulations that really only make it worthwhile for some of the biggest elevator companies in the world to manufacture parts for the North American market. And that's why, for me, the big sort of aha moment at the end of the video is like, hey, we've got an oligopoly around elevator parts in North America, because it turns out like it's really just the biggest players, and I won't name their names, but like it's only the biggest players that can really can afford to actually compete in this market. Now, of course, I'd be missing out an important factor if I didn't touch on labor. I didn't get into it for the video, but I know elevator labor is also another big challenge as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for that discussion, especially of what's called the technical elevator standard. I think a lot of people focus on the size of North American elevators, and they are larger for the stretcher, for this sort of quasi turning radius. And I think there should be some discussion about the trade-offs about size, but it's not the only issue. And this standard issue, the market harmonization, it's kind of hard. I always find it's very difficult to express. But I recommend everyone to watch Yutei's video if they're interested in knowing more about that, because I think he gives some good concrete examples of these technical little details and how it means that a mid-sized elevator manufacturer is just not worth it to try to enter the North American market, and so we end up with a less competitive sector. So I got a question back to about sort of the economics of development to Shane. So accessibility for people who are disabled and absolutely need elevators is very important, but there are other ramifications of not having elevators. I've noticed in my own neighborhood, the buildings that don't have elevators rent for less, and that could be good if you don't need the elevator, but it's also not great for the economics of the project. So I guess I wanted to know, leaving aside the question of accessibility, developers in Portland, if they can sort of get through this fire marshal opposition to the four-story single stair buildings, and they, don't build them with elevators, do they have experience building four-story walk-ups? And do you think that, a lack of, realistically being able to put elevators in these buildings will harm the economics of these projects? Like, do you think a four-story walk-up will even, if we've established that it's not really worth it to put an elevator in a four-story building, is it
Right.
possible to make the economics of a four-story walk-up work? Or are we just going to end up with tall townhouses or the sites going undeveloped?
Mm. Oh,
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Portland has a chunk of four-story walk-ups. I've developed a four-story walk-up project on my own. Interestingly, in our four stories, the first floor rents first, the fourth floor rents second, and then the second and third floors are somehow the ones that are kind of longest to lease up. But I think what you pointed out is kind of absolutely right. There's a real rent cap on kind of what you can expect to rent a four-story walk-up for without an elevator, which limits, I think, how it usually gets implemented. I think we see most of the four-story walk-ups in the West Coast without elevators, either smaller studio micro ones or affordable housing, where there's kind of a inherent rent cap on what those units can be rented or sold for. Um, and so I expect that, yeah, the four-story walk-ups will be developed in those typologies that have a naturally limited rent ceiling anyway, which will kind of dramatically reduce how often we see the single stair four-story building get implemented, um, which is really obviously limiting, right? I think as you start to build elevator costs into your pro forma, it just wipes out the ability to provide kind of higher rental flats that would be competitive in more desirable neighborhoods. So it pushes developers to kind of either look towards under developing their lots and not maximizing density and building townhomes, or looking to larger land assemblies where you can get, 40 plus units on a lot and spread out that cost of the elevator further. Um, so if I think we saw a tweak in elevator costs, bringing them, in parity or double parity to kind of European or Asian standards, we'd see a lot of infill housing get unlocked in these more desirable neighborhoods with better school districts and amenities, where you could create a kind of higher price point elevator served flat that'd be more efficient, more sustainable, more accessible, et cetera. But we just have a lot of underdevelopment because we can't afford elevators, pushing us into kind of townhome construction instead of more dense infill.
Thank you for that. So, this next question is for you, Tay. So it is, elevators are very expensive. It'll be hard to bring down the costs. It sounds like, Cassie can rent in a large building with an elevator. Shane can finance a large building with an elevator. Why do we need small buildings? Like, if it's hard to stick an elevator in a small building, why don't we just build a bunch of big buildings and leave the small buildings aside?
That's an interesting question to me. I mean, I don't have any hate for large buildings personally. I think they can work really well. Um, but I mean, gosh, I don't want to go into a total like urbanist nerd, love letter to, the missing middle and the small scale urbanism. And I feel like to some extent I don't have to because I think, whether you agree with you like these sort of missing middle buildings or not. I mean, I think the reality is that a lot of cities are looking to build this sort of housing. I mean, that's what the politics seem to be favoring. I mean, here right across Canada, I mean, a story I'm working on is just how much cities, municipalities have kind of all together at the same time just introduced a wave of missing middle housing policy. So I think there is clearly a ton of public support for this scale of housing. And as this kind of housing is being unlocked and being developed, I think we're pushing up against certain codes, such as elevators, that really uh, impact and perhaps harm the perception of this type of housing. I would hate for a bunch of missing middle housing to be built and for people to kind of end up feeling like, hey, like this actually just doesn't work because it's this really skinny townhouse that has, three stairs cases along it, or it's a 4, 5, 6 story walk-up apartment. I think we'd be really shooting ourselves in the foot if, as cities and governments in both our countries pursued this housing policy, which I mean, for my own personal beliefs, think is a great kind of housing policy. Um, without considering some of these codes, like elevators. And I think, Shane brought up a really interesting, yeah, thought to me, just that, like, it's like this housing is getting built whether we want it or not. And I think, that it's such a worthwhile endeavor for me to explore ways that we can make elevators affordable enough to put in these sorts of buildings, because who knows what kind of market demand there is for that kind of stuff. I mean, if a family would never consider a four-story walk-up if it doesn't have an elevator, well, if we bring the cost of that elevator down, even like 50%, does that unlock, the ability for that elevator to be included, and then for that family to find it, viable for them to move into a place like that. So, yeah, that'd be kind of my quick thought on it. Is like, yeah, of course, I mean, personally love this sort of scale of housing, but I think whether we like it or not, we're kind of riding this wave right now of this type of building typology. I expect to see much more of it in the decades to come, and I really think we're setting ourselves for a major accessibility disaster and kind of frustration with this sort of housing if we aren't getting our act together on elevator codes. And I recently learned about garbage codes or garbage regulations. So yeah, like there's a lot of things we need to think about, not just the density of the housing we're building right now.
I just recently published a report about waste handling costs in New York City, and I would love a
Ooh.
waste handling and collection video. I think it's underexplored.
It,
But anyway, back to elevators. I've got a question. This one I'm going to ask Cassie and then Shane. So sort of user and owner perspective. Something that surprised me when I wrote this report was to learn that about 70% of the elevators industry revenue doesn't come from the installation of elevators, but from the service, the maintenance, and then what are called the modernization. So every 30 years or so, you've got to essentially rebuild the elevator, sort of, like a new elevator, old shaft kind of thing. So I wanted to sort of ask questions about, once a building's got an elevator, the question to Cassie is, is it sort of a binary? It's got an elevator, it doesn't, or as someone who depends on an elevator, would you rent in a building with a single elevator? Do you think about the reliability of it? I know you've never gotten stuck in one yet, but do how does the reliability of an elevator factor into your decision making and just sort of experience living in a place? And then the question to Shane is, once a building's got an elevator, you're owning it, you're owning the elevator. What is it like dealing with those companies? What is it like dealing with maintenance? What's it like, making sure your tenants aren't, yelling at you all the time about the elevator being broken? So first, I'm going to give it to Cassie to give us the user experience, and then Shane to the owner.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably that was probably the only accessibility thing I did think about when I was going to look for apartments for the first time. I couldn't imagine living in a building that only had one elevator because I had really only heard horror stories from, especially, I mean, to be fair, like a lot of non-disabled friends, but who lived in older buildings that had one crappy elevator and it was out all the time. But even, disabled friends and disabled people across the country who share their experiences of like, yeah, no, I'm just stranded in my apartment for months. Um, but I actually think I thought about it more because I've never been stranded in an elevator. I actually think I thought about it more from a what do I do if the power goes out perspective. And so the first building I lived in did have two elevators, and honestly, I'm really glad it did because one or the other were pretty consistently out of order, but that redundancy made it so I never had an issue still being able to get in and out of my building. There were a couple times that the power was out. And of course, it was when I was not home. And so I'm just like, cool, I need to just like figure out where to be until I'm allowed to go home. Thankfully, all of that was resolved quickly, but I just this last weekend moved into a building to have a more accessible unit, but it only has one elevator, so I'm definitely like it lives in the back of my mind. But I think because of the current state of elevator maintenance in this country and like how long elevators stay out of order for, um, I really like would prefer to live on a ground floor until like we start seeing a pattern where that is not the case. But ironically, the buildings that are big enough to have accessible units are also usually, at least in Portland, multi-use buildings. So the ground floor is some combination of entirely retail or retail and parking. The building I'm in now has three accessible units, and there are some ground floor units in this building. None of them are the accessible units. So very interesting to learn and experience that out in the world more. Um, yeah, I would definitely sleep better at night if I lived on a ground floor, or if we simply fix the elevator industry in this country.
Shane, give us the
Yeah,
owner perspective owning an elevator. I hear everyone just loves owning an elevator. It's very simple and easy.
yeah, I think to Yute's point earlier, the oligopoly piece is kind of more prevalent in the maintenance than it is in the installation. So I think you get your elevator in, and then when it's in and you have to maintain it, you have proprietary parts and proprietary service technicians you can call out with proprietary servicing systems, and it just um, is long and expensive. And I think frankly, the development patterns around elevators are also driven by like I think developer scar tissue, right? Where a lot of folks own buildings with elevators, and if they're going to go do another similar building that could be a little smaller and not have an elevator, um, people get tired of kind of the ongoing asset management component of dealing with elevator companies and understandably furious tenants, and just it becomes this ongoing you know, issue for how you deal with, the relationship to the folks who live in your building and how you um, deal with your maintenance staff. And it just drives kind of all sorts of issues that if we were in a system where you could have a third party elevator specialist that weren't beholden to one of the big 4 or 5 elevator companies, it would change how good of service you could provide for the folks that you are housing, and also just make the ongoing maintenance something you're not fighting against mentally when you're thinking about how you plan for elevators and future projects.
The proprietary versus non-proprietary firm thing was something that stood out to me comparing the US and European markets. It seems like in Europe, what we're really missing in the US is like a strong, advanced, non-proprietary elevator, manufacturer and servicing
Right.
ecosystem. Because proprietary meaning you're sort of stuck with, only one company really knows how to do it. Nothing's truly 100% proprietary, but the big four manufacturers do tend to make it such that you kind of got to keep them or it can get kind of difficult to maintain them. Whereas in Europe, this, really deep competitive market means there's a lot of these sort of mid-sized firms that we don't have in the US, like Orona or Schmidt and Son or Clayman are some of the brands I noticed in Europe that we don't really have in the US. This final one, I'm gonna turn this one into a lightning round because we're going a little late. So we need elevator reform. It's hard. There are difficult issues around sizes, around the technical safety standard, around the labor issues. So I'm going to ask you each in turn, how would you sell this to policymakers to take on such a hairy issue? Strategy, messaging, however you want to approach the question. I'm gonna ask it in reverse order this time. First, I'm gonna go to Yute, then I'm gonna go to Cassie, then I'm gonna go to Shane. So lightning round, try to give it to me in like 15, 20 seconds. Yute first, you.
Okay. 15, 20 seconds. Okay. I think my big sort of thought was, it's a complex topic, so I think it's helpful to break it up into little parts. And I think what the folks in Seattle did with its recent bill on elevators reform was quite good in that, we're ta tackling the size first. I think that's kind of the easiest issue for policymakers to quickly understand and latch onto. And then once we get that, and once we get people thinking, oh, why is the government revisiting elevator codes? Then we can sort of have the broader conversation about the bigger issues around oligopolies and build like and codes. That'd be my sort of 2 cents on it.
Yeah,
Next,
to
Cassie,
add on
please.
to that, I think, for me, I'm always bringing my lived experience to my legislative advocacy, and very much encourage anyone working on this issue to work hand in hand with disabled community members. But really, I mean, I think to me, it's like we're an outlier. The US is an outlier and not in a good way. Or I mean, I guess all of North America. I keep forgetting that it's thankful. I'm like, it's not just us for once. But we clearly have a problem because of how few elevators there are, how expensive they are, how long they're broken. And so it's just like pointing to other countries, pointing to data where it's working fine. I think is something I'm going to lean on.
Yeah, agreed. I think it just pointing to the already defined approach the rest of the world takes and letting local jurisdictions opt into that framework instead of the currently defined framework.
Thank you. All right, so now we've got a bunch of Q&A questions from the audience, and I'm going to read them and assign them, or maybe be greedy and take some of them myself. So the first two, actually, there's sort of two in there combined. They're just generally about the challenges from the elevator industry groups, like, sort of the manufacturers, what are called the big four. I'll list them. Otis, Kone, Schindler, ThyssenKrupp. There's a couple little Japanese ones that are sometimes maybe Mitsubishi is sometimes the fifth one. So, what do you face objections from these groups? How do you overcome them? How do you address them in the future? And the other one is like, what does it take for the building codes and standards to be changed to allow smaller elevators? And are the companies operating in the US and Canada against these changes? I think I probably had the most experience with the elevator companies, so I'm going to take this one. They are generally not really pleased when anyone outside of the elevator industry, sort of enters the conversation at all. A bit of a strained relationship, I would say. Some of the things that we are pushing for are things that they either like or should like. So, as an example, like just the goal of trying to build elevators into buildings that currently don't have them. I think generally they should be in favor of it. The elevator industry generally does not like different states and cities within the US, Canada, provinces, changing things. And I think they would like everyone to be on the same code within North America. That said, I don't think they're terribly enthusiastic about moving to the global standard, which was formerly the European standard, is now really the global standard. I don't exactly know why, I could guess, but because the big four companies, actually pretty much all the companies, except the smallest ones, are already active abroad. I mean, Kone, Schindler, ThyssenKrupp, those are all European elevator companies. Most of their sales, most of their units are in, actually basically Europe and China nowadays, and all of those tend to be built to the European/global standard. Nevertheless, they're not terribly enthusiastic about it coming to the US. I don't know if that's due to sort of individual personalities being fundamentally, American and Canadian elevator people, and sort of growing up in that, or if there's something about not wanting to open up the market a little bit more. I'm not sure. You know, the bill that passed in Washington, I do not believe had the support of the elevator industry. So it's always nice to have as much support as you can, but sometimes you don't need it. Sometimes there's just fundamental opposition, and you have to speak to the users of the elevator, to speak for the users of the elevator, and, tell lawmakers. Sometimes you have to pass things that the industry is not pleased with. I would hope that we can build a bridge to the elevator industry. But it's a pretty closed off industry. Even within the building code world, the elevators sort of sit literally in their own shaft. No one else is allowed to touch them. When you've got a window or a door or even a mechanical or plumbing system, you can get a handyman who, fiddles around with it a little bit, whether they should or not. Elevators, it's a very much a no-go. Only the mechanic's allowed to play with the elevator. And the industry sort of takes that attitude. They don't really want people interfering in it. So a next question, sorry, I was answering a question, I was not reading them. So this is related to accessibility and rental housing, which is how can property managers, building owners, et cetera, better understand and then inform prospective tenants of units about accessibility? I'm going to give this one to you, Cassie, by the way. And is there sort of a best practice for this? Is there a policy push? Basically, what can owners, I'll expand that to designers or whatever, do to, sell the accessible units and the benefits of it, or make them more accessible to you, Cassie?
Yeah, I mean, at least for me, just like as a average renter, like looking for units, like I look up buildings and then I'm like looking at the floor plan page of their website, and the fact that they don't simply just add the word accessible if it's accessible. I mean, it could be that easy. I do think, because of the lack of accessible housing, I think there's education to be done both on the property management side and also on like disabled tenants knowing what to look for, and what's possible. Because I definitely didn't know, but also my property manager didn't know. And so yeah, I think it could be some combination of best practice, could be policy change. Something we heard a lot this last session when we were trying to increase the number of accessible units, was this idea that they sit empty, that non-disabled people don't want to use them. And after just moving into one, um, the property manager here said, actually, a lot of non-disabled people are really interested in this unit, so you need to act fast if you want it. And most buildings that I looked into just didn't have any available at all. So I think that by actually listing them as accessible on their website where they're advertising their units already, that would really start to make a difference in just having that information be readily available.
This next question is for Shane. Cassie mentioned the power going out sometimes. I feel very lucky. Actually, here, Yuta, here's the next video for you. It's underground power and why we don't have underground power lines and why we don't have it in North America. Because in New York City, we do have underground power lines and the power never goes out. I've been here for 15 years, power's never gone out. But in much of America, the power lines are above ground, the power goes out, and the elevator is out of service. And someone asked, like, are there generators or are there battery backups for that? My understanding is the fire department likes to keep it for themselves. So, yeah, there's a generator, but it's only when we want it. It's only for us to use. But do you, I've also heard that generators can often be required for elevators, and that can be a big cost driver. Tell us a little bit about generators, backup power, anything you know about it. If you don't, that's okay. This is a topic that I didn't cover much in my report, but it was interesting to me too.
I have to plead some ignorance on the nuances of backup generated power. Usually in modern elevators, you'll have a backup generator, won't be a huge diesel one, but it will be, like a battery bank. But it's not going to run your elevator when the power's out. In smaller infill buildings. I'm not sure how the requirements work on a 20-story high rise. I think those do have like bigger diesel roof mounted systems for backup, but I have to plead ignorance here. Sorry.
No problem. I was actually looking for someone to write a little report about generators, and it was very hard to find somebody. They're this system that like is very expensive in buildings, causes a lot of coordination issues, and no one seems to actually like own the generator. No design, someone specifies it and then someone designs it, and no one seems to know like when is it required. And I asked on Blue Sky like when is a generator required in a building, and I got so many conflicting answers, and it essentially boiled down to like, well, the fire department just tells us, and it doesn't seem like it's often based in a literal reading of the code, but rather their own beliefs about it. I'm going to answer the last question that was answered in the QSA about regulations about how long it can take to. So someone says there's regulations about how long it can take to repair things like heat in apartments. Do you think regulations prioritizing a quick turnaround for elevator repair would help, or does the oligopoly have to be addressed first? This is a very interesting question. Something that was very interesting to learn in my report was it takes about 2 or sometimes 3 times as long to install and modernize an elevator in the US compared to Europe. Some of this, unfortunately, gets into this very thorny labor issue. There's all of these ways that you can prefabricate and pre-assemble elevators when you're installing them or even modernizing them that the union contract in the United States does not allow, which creates more work for the union, but unfortunately more work also means more time. On the day-to-day sort of repairs, not this sort of once-in-a-generation renewal, modernization of the elevator, but just something basic, the elevator is out of service for a day or two. My understanding is that it would be quite complicated to regulate because, sometimes you just have issues and, like different repairs can take different amounts of time. And then, if you don't have a part and it's, COVID or the Strait of Hormuz is blocked or, whatever geopolitical thing happens, I would think it would be very difficult for regulators to regulate. And I feel like this is one issue where you kind of needs to be a carrot and a stick approach. On the one hand, you want regulators to make sure that, people are not leaving the elevator out of service because they just don't want to fix it. On the other hand, there's a limit to how much you can push the market if the sort of conditions are not right, with a competitive field of operators and, efficient labor and things. So I think that's a thorny issue. And unfortunately, I kind of suspect that it's not something that cities are going to be able to like effectively regulate very well. And we kind of need to fix the issue on a more sort of fundamental level. Yeah, that's my answer to that.
I had a quick thought, if you don't mind me adding on to it, Stephen. Yeah, because
Please.
this question reminded me of a point that didn't make it into the video, but there's a really interesting anecdote out of Ontario where the Auditor General there looked into what was going on behind all of these elevators in the province that were failing their frick, I think it's like some sort of inspection. Like they were basically like elevator repairs in Ontario were just going so poorly that they had the Auditor General investigate what's going on there. And what they specifically cited in their report was, oh, like, the what is it called? The body that inspects these elevators could revoke the license of some of these repair providers, these companies. But because of the oligopoly, because like four companies basically manage, a quarter of the elevator stock each, it would be such a disruption to the level of service that they didn't feel like it was feasible to actually revoke their license. So I think this is a case where the oligopoly strikes again. Like, yeah, we could, in theory, have a bit more of a stick to compel elevator repair companies to repair elevators faster, but because they hold so much significant market share, taking away their I don't know license to do so would be such a disruption that they just don't bother doing it in this case.
Yeah, that's an uncomfortable fact when you only have four or five companies. Taking away a license can be a powerful incentive, but can't really afford to only have three or four companies.
Exactly.
Yes, that's so I think we're basically at time.
Yeah.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you to the panelists. And elevator reform, in terms of building codes and standards, I think the sort of YIMBY world's first exposure to this was single stair buildings. And, part of the goal of my organization is to move on to other topics and elevators and plumbing and, all these other sorts of things. So I'm very like heartened by the interest in elevators. And I think, one thing I wrote in my report was I think elevators are really like a microcosm for issues in the construction, sector in North America. We've got codes and standards, we've got harmonization, we've got labor, we've got overdimensioning and sort of difficult trade-offs, between, competing groups. So I would encourage everyone to watch Yute's video, follow, 1,000 Friends of Oregon for, everything that's going on. Check out one of Shane's buildings, an affordable developer, if you need to apply, there you go. And thank you to Dan, thank you to Sightline, and thank you all for attending.